Welcome, everyone, to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. My name is Alan Miller, and I'm a member of the Planning Committee for ICSS Sunday morning sessions. We're based in Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our weekly programs are online via Zoom every Sunday morning at 10:30 a.m. Pacific Time. You can sign up at our website, icssmarks.org, to receive email announcements for our Sunday sessions. That's icssmarks.org. Our program today is on the current situation on the Korean Peninsula and the U.S. out of Korea campaign. And I have to say that I woke up this morning and took a quick glance at the news, and what's going on in the world today is quite scary. We have the potential use of long-range missiles by Ukraine and NATO against Russia. We have a warning by Lebanon's UK envoy of a doomsday scenario for West Asia and the deployment of tens of thousands of troops in Western Asia and the Middle East. The Korean Peninsula hasn't been in this week's news so much, but is another flashpoint and a dangerous situation that the world is facing today. We're very fortunate to have two speakers on the Korea Peninsula today. The first is Paul Liem, who's been active on Korea issues for 4 decades and has visited North Korea in 3 different occasions, on 3 different decades. He's director of the Korea Policy Institute and is an activist in the U.S. out of Korea campaign. Jeeho is a member of Nodutdol for Korean Community Development, an organization that fights for Korea's national liberation and a world free of imperialism. We will have a presentation by Paul and Jeeho, followed by a short break for announcements, and then we will have questions from our session participants. Welcome, Paul and Jeeho, to Sunday morning at the Marxist Library. And Paul, if you want to take over from here, go right ahead.
Thank you. It's good to be back at the library. Alan informed me that there's a lot of interest among the library clientele members in recent policy changes in North Korea with regard to the matter of reunification and its nuclear programs and so forth. So I think mainly what has been on all our minds in terms of these changes have been North Korea's decision to move away from the decades-old policy of pursuing a peaceful, independent reunification of Korea with the hand in hand with the South Korean regime or government, and with the hope or the understanding that the United States would support favorable international conditions for independent reunification of Korea. So this has gone by the wayside, and actually Kim Jong-un in January proposed that a change in the constitution, which would establish the two countries, North and South Korea, as actually separate states and facing each other as belligerents. So this statement caused many in the policy establishment in the United States to fear that North Korea was preparing to launch an invasion or a military attack of some sort on South Korea. In any case, the Supreme People's Assembly will be convening this October 7th, I believe. And so these changes that were proposed back in January we're assuming will be taken up at the at the Supreme People's Assembly, and that some changes to the Constitution will be made. I want to say that the call for the peaceful, independent reunification of Korea has been the sort of holy grail of the reunification movement in South Korea, North Korea, and in the diaspora for some, for longer than a lot of people can remember. And it has sort of the status of uh, a platform that is pure in its intention and almost synonymous with being a peace activist or a Korean patriot or what have you. But I thought I should today just point out that the the call for the peaceful and independent reunification that has united so many of us for all these years was not always, in effect with regard to the Korea question. And actually, it itself arose out of certain historical developments in the early 1970s that made the idea of actually joining hands with the Park Chung-hee dictatorship and marching forward to reunification as something feasible. This namely was in the minds of President Kim Il-sung was U.S. Policy of rapprochement with China. And what the North Koreans noticed about this rapprochement is that the United States was the first time willing to normalize relations with a communist country without demanding territorial concessions and without demanding regime change or change in the social system, but was actually entering into talks to normalize relations while accepting the People's Republic of China as being the power in force in China. And at this time, also Nixon was pursuing a more peaceful course with the Soviet Union. So with that in mind, Kim Il-sung thought, well, if the United States is willing to, engage in détente with the large socialist countries, why not also with the smaller countries? And so this prompted him to consider the possibility that the United States would support or would not oppose the South Korean regime entering in some sort of reunification negotiations with North Korea. And from the point of view of Park Chung-hee, he looked at this situation that was developing in between the United States and China, and he said to himself, well, if the United States is going to do this with China, they might do this with North Korea. And if that is the case, we need to we're going to have to go along with this. If our patron is going in this direction, then somehow we're going to have to jump on this bandwagon and try to steer it on a course that's to our advantage. So there was, from both points of view, the idea that North and South Korea could come to some sort of fruitful negotiations about this issue. And this, of course, for the many decades since, has been the pattern in North-South initiatives at reunification talks. It has always been preceded by some sort of crisis that has caused the United States to take a second look at its policy of trying to isolate North Korea. But in any case, I wanted to go back and talk a little bit about the genesis of the policy that is just gone by the wayside. So to give us some historical perspective on what the policies have been and where they are heading. So I'll share my screen. And let's see. And
Looks good.
people see the screen?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. So the foundation of every platform on reunification that has united the Koreans in Korea and the diaspora is this July 4th North-South Joint Communique. It was penned by Kim Il-sung and presented to Lee Hoo-rak, who was the head of the South Korean KCIA, who went to Pyongyang and representing Park Chung-hee to engage with North Korea on this topic. And so it established three principles that reunification should be achieved independently by peaceful means and on the basis of great national unity transcending differences of ideology and social system. Subsequent to this was signed by Lee Hoo-rak and Kim Yong-ju, who is the younger brother of Kim Il-sung at the time. Subsequently, Park Chung-hee declared martial law in October 1972. So Kim Il-sung's thinking in presenting this proposal was that if both governments of North and South Korea could agree to these principles, it would create space within South Korean society for progressive forces and democratic forces and underground revolutionary forces to engage openly in conversation, dialogue about this issue, and that this prospect of North-South reconciliation would become a leading political trend within South Korean politics. And his hope was that this would promote the emergence of it would free up a long suppressed democratic movement in South Korea that would eventually bring into power a progressive government that would carry through in negotiating these principles with North Korea. Because until this time, democratic forces, the labor movement, and underground revolutionary forces in South Korea have been just completely repressed and gone underground. So this was, from North Korea's point of view, an opportunity to create a political situation in the peninsula, in North and South, for the people of Korea to rise up and take control of this issue. Now, Park Chung-hee declared martial law, and sort of that was his card to eliminate the possibility of this reunification issue being taken up by the masses. And actually, as a result of martial law, the Park Chung-hee dictatorship monopolized the conversation in the North-South Coordinating Committee on this issue. And it was the first setback to this approach. So the following year, the DPRK, since Park Chung-hee was monopolizing the meeting on the South Korean side, the DPRK put forward proposals that would challenge the South Korean government in terms of his call to the call of the joint communique for to stop the use of weapons on the peninsula. So it called for mutual disarmament, ending introduction of foreign weapons. Um, Alan, can you like keep track of my time? So I want to split this with Jeeho,
Sure.
but I can't tell what's
Okay.
going on here.
When would you like me to give you I'll give you a couple minutes warning. When would you
Yeah,
like me to
give me
do that?
a couple of minutes more.
Okay. And how long should I Jiho when should I split this?
Maybe give each of us a half an hour.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, and you'll also notice that this called for a peace agreement between the North and South. That's my typo, between the North and South. So this did not this did not get anywhere with the PAC regime. And in June of 1973, Park Chung-hee countered by proposing the simultaneous entry of North and South Korea into the United Nations and called upon the socialist countries to recognize the Republic of Korea. So, in effect, he realized that, he was going to lose uh, the moral high ground in the negotiations with the North Korea on reunification. So what he did was uh, he essentially proposed that North and South Korea uh, would would enter. He essentially proposed the consolidation of a two Korea policy, two Koreas that could get along together, but uh, would not be obliged to reunify, and and um, and it was the foundation of South Korea's uh, international diplomatic campaign to win the allegiance of socialist countries, which at that point were, essentially allied only with the DPRK. So a few days later, Kim called for uh, the foundation of the Confederate Republic of Korea, and that the Koreas would enter the United Nations as this confederated republic, and that this confederation would be founded um, as the outcome of the convening of a national Congress comprised of people of all strata in North and South Korea. Then, a couple months later, some of you may remember, but Park Chung-hee KCIA kidnapped Kim Dae-jung, who was attending a conference in Japan. And Kim Dae-jung is someone, obviously, who, uh, as an anti-dictatorship dissident, would have probably championed the joint communique had he been allowed to continue to organize in South Korea. He later became president of South Korea. Subsequently, the DPRK declared an end to the dialogue on the tripartite, on the joint communique. They demanded the removal of Lee Hoo-rak from the coordinating committee for the kidnapping of Kim Dae-jung and for promoting the two Korea policy, simultaneously entry to the UN. And they called for the reconstitution of the committee to include representatives of social organizations on both sides, again, trying to broaden the discussion of reunification as a popular issue. The following year, the DPRK called for a peace treaty with the United States. So the call for the peace treaty with the United States was emerged as a recognition on the part of North Korea that it could not negotiate um, a peace with South Korea, and it could not negotiate, it could not take reunification talks with South Korea any further unless the United States were willing to make peace with it. So Kim Il-sung reached out to Carter and subsequent administrations for peace talks. And as we know, the Carter administration and subsequent administrations never agreed to peace talks. So I want to, as a bookend to this section, this is a May interview, 1972, with Kim Il-sung by Harrison Salisbury. This is a couple of months before the joint communique was signed, and it shows his thinking at the time, at the start of this diplomatic approach that he's about to launch. If the United States has changed its policy in relation to China and the Soviet Union, I don't think they need military bases in the South anymore. If they withdraw their forces from South Korea, then it would help Koreans to harmonize with each other and will help us improve our sentiments towards the United States. We remember all the speeches made by Nixon in China. What interests me most is Nixon said the world should not be divided and countries should not be divided when he looked up at the Great Wall of China. So I am watching with great interest what channel his words will take in practice. So, you know, I think in effect from Kim Il-sung's point of view, the July 4th communique was actually a test, you know, of this, of putting to test this theory that the United States may carry through its rapprochement with China to a rapprochement with the smaller countries, including Korea. So fast forward to today, January 15th, 2024. This is Kim Jong-un. He says, it is the final conclusion drawn from the bitter history of inter-Korea relations that we cannot go along with the road of national restoration and reunification together with the ROK clan that adopted as its state policy an all-out confrontation with a republic, dreaming of the collapse of our government and unification by absorption, and lost compatriotic consciousness, getting more vicious and arrogant in the madcap confrontation. So these are the changes he proposed to the Constitution. These are essentially a quid pro quo or a response to positions and developments taken in the preceding year and a half by the administration of Yoon Suk-yeol. Yoon Suk-yeol, in a defense paper in South Korea, declared North and South Korea as hostile states and North Korea as the principal enemy of South Korea. Yoon Suk-yeol replaced the minister of the Ministry of Unification with an individual who has publicly called for regime change in North Korea. The illegal northern limit line cannot be tolerated. The northern limit line is illegal. I mean, it is a 3-mile convention drawn up by the United States, originally to prevent Syngman Rhee from attacking North Korea. But the legal limit for territorial waters is 12 nautical miles. So this is a matter that has resulted in clashes between North and South Korea, but is also a line which the United Nations Command has not enforced when North Korean fishing boats have crossed over to do fishing. The only position, this has caused a lot of concern. I just want to point out that this issue was addressed by Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un in 1918 at their summit meeting, in which the two sides agreed to take practical measures to arrive at conventions that would turn this area into a peace zone for fishing. So I just say that so that we are not concerned that the minute a North Korean fishing vessel crosses the northern limit line, it will result in a nuclear conflagration. It will not. But South Korea's constitution defines the territory of the Republic of Korea as the entirety of the Korean peninsula. So the North Koreans are saying, well, we need to define this territory for ourselves. Phrases misrepresenting North and South as fellow countrymen should be removed, given that going forward, the two countries will recognize each other as sovereign, separate nations, that North and South Koreans will be subsequently citizens of their respective sovereign states. If war breaks out, the Constitution should specify the issue of subjugating, reclaiming, and annexing Iraq. This is the statement that caused so many people to think that the North Koreans were going to invade South Korea. But this, I want to point out that this is really clearly a double standard, because how often has the United States and South Korea threatened North Korea with total annihilation should it attack South Korea? How many times has Yoon Suk-yeol, Lloyd Austin, and other folks, stated that North Korea will be ended. It will be the end of North Korea if they attack South Korea. But for some reason, when the North Koreans say, if you attack us, we're going to subjugate and annex you, it's kind of like they can't say that. So Kim Jong-un has said that, and we'll see how this winds up in their constitution, if it does or not. Another important aspect of his talk to the SPA in January is he made a clarification on the rationale for the development of the nuclear weapons, and he's just saying here that our nuclear weapons program is not only for the purpose of deterring war. He's saying that it is also for the purpose of winning the war. And so he ends by saying, it will inflict an unimaginably crushing calamity and defeat upon the U.S. and will terribly destroy the entity called the Republic of Korea. In effect, this is a counter threat in response to U.S. South Korea threats towards it. I
We've got
want to point out that,
about five more minutes or so.
okay, that's
Mm-hmm.
perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to point out that 2/3 of his speech in January, had nothing to do with nuclear weapons or his attitude towards South Korean Yoon Suk-yeol, but 2/3 of it was really about developing the regional economy. They have a 2010 program pledged to construct factories in 20 counties and city each year for 10 years. And a rural housing construction plan. to turn all rural villages in the country into socialist villages. And as of May 24, new housing has opened up in at least 190 locations spread across most counties, according to this one analyst who writes for 38 North, a Stanford-based website. This is a model city project that was completed in 2020. So the 20 by 10 reconstruction and the rural housing reconstruction that is envisioned across the country will be modeled against this particular city project. So what North Korea is really doing is they are fending off what they consider to be the possibility of attack by the United States and South Korea so that they can, within this space, consolidate the development of its country on the basis of its socialist economy. So the last thing I want to say is that the idea of peaceful, independent reunification of Korea, if we want to consider that to have been a prospect that was put to the test by North Korea, the answer is not that Korea cannot be reunified peacefully and independently. The answer is simply that this cannot happen while the United States is pursuing maintain. This cannot happen under the circumstances where the Korean peninsula, the southern half, is dominated by a South Korean regime that is allied with U.S. hegemonic interests in Northeast Asia. And so going forward, the DPRK, has, gone all in with this movement to establish a multipolar world order, and in particular has signed a comprehensive partnership with Russia, with the desire to protect international justice from hegemonic aspirations and attempts to impose a unipolar world. So I'll just end with, what are prospects for the peaceful reunification of Korea in a multipolar world? Well, given that the DPRK and the ROC are now facing each other as separate sovereign entities, there is nothing to prevent them under the right geopolitical circumstances from normalizing relations with each other, from engaging in disarmament talks, for aligning their respective foreign policies to protect the sovereignty of their respective countries and also of both countries' claim to the peninsula as their home. So it's not the end of, I think, the peaceful reunification of Korea. It is something, however, that I think we all need to recognize, what is not possible, under the current geopolitical U.S.-dominated order in Northeast Asia, and that if we're going to support the Korean people's desire for peaceful reunification, we're going to need to struggle for the United States to take its place as one among many poles in the world and to push back on U.S. imperialism in Northeast Asia, in the European continent, and in the Middle East, and particularly as we are all calling out for peace in Ukraine and in Palestine, the liberation of Palestine. So with that, I'll end my talk.
Thank you, Paul. Jeeho, if you would take over And maybe since a lot of people joined a bit late, you might want to do a quick introduction of who you are and what you're going to talk about. Let's see.
Absolutely. Just give me
Okay.
1 second. I'm just setting up my system here. But thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Jeeho, and I'm an organizer with Nodutdol for Korean Community Development. And I'll share a little bit more about what Nodutdol is and what we do in a bit. But first, I just want to thank you, Alan, for the invitation to speak, and also Paul to speak alongside you. Um, for my portion of the presentation, I'd like to dovetail from what Paul shared with us today and highlight how those of us in the diaspora have responded to the reunification line announced by North Korea and have specifically clarified our approach to struggle against US imperialism in order to establish the national liberation of Korea, particularly through what we're calling the US Out of Korea campaign. And so can you just give me a thumbs up that you can see my slides here? Awesome. Great. Thank you. So I'd like to start with a very, very brief history of Nodutdol. And for those of you who may not be familiar, Nodutdol was founded in New York in 1999. And since then, we've participated in efforts to advance peace and reunification in our homeland. One of our hallmark programs is to organize international delegation trips to both North and South Korea to link diasporic organizers with the experiences and struggles of people in Korea. And we've also sought to bring back some of those learnings and lessons to educate and inform people within the United States about the ongoing state of war and division in Korea. And today we've expanded beyond New York to SoCal and the Bay Area with plans to grow our movement elsewhere. And as Koreans living in the United States, we see the crucial necessity of bringing together fellow Koreans in diaspora and our allies to fight for the national liberation of our homeland and to bring about a world free of US imperialism. Because we believe that joining the struggle against imperialism is a responsibility that those of us within the US must take up as a most urgent task. Earlier in the presentation, Alan mentioned reading the news and just seeing how scary the world is. And I think we can point to a plethora of crises all across the world inflamed by imperialist forces. And Korea is no exception. Because as we speak, the United States' incessant march towards war brings Korea closer to a renewed state of conflict. Since taking office, Joe Biden has pursued a strategy of increasing hostility and aggression against North Korea, wielding a proverbial stick to threaten North Korea into submission. In 2023 alone, the United States held 200 days of war drills on the peninsula, rehearsing the invasion of North Korea and the decapitation of its leaders. And South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol, who came into office in 2022, has been more than happy to adopt Biden's strategy of aggression and has himself displayed a hawkish attitude towards the North. And you can see here in this picture, Yoon is actually singing American Pie at a state function in DC upon his visit, really highlighting some of the kind of weird dynamics and the way that he's acting kind of as a puppet of US interests. And within this hostile atmosphere, as Paul mentioned before, North Korea announced that earlier this year it would no longer be pursuing a strategy of peaceful reunification with South Korea. And at first glance, if you understand the kind of outrageous threats that North Korea is under, it may appear that North Korea's announcement emerges out of only the aggressive positioning demonstrated by Biden and Yoon. But this is not the only factor. Because for decades, North Korea had pursued diplomacy to normalize relations with the United States and achieve a full denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, including from US nuclear threats. And similarly, as Paul highlighted for us, they led efforts to reach a lasting resolution to the Korean War and an independent, peaceful reunification with the South. And you may recall that in April 2018, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in signed the Panmunjom Declaration, affirming the two Koreas' commitment to true and independent peaceful reunification. And certainly this moment sparked an upswell of hope for a resolution to the 70-year-long Korean War and the reunification of a divided country and people. And as we also know, Kim met with Trump later that year to continue these talks, which marked a historic moment for US and North Korea relations. But we're now in 2024, and we know and can see that these diplomatic efforts have unraveled. The United States refused to negotiate meaningfully with North Korea, insisting that North Korea denuclearize without promising the lifting of US sanctions. And the United States remained obstinate in its position. And given this, the talks failed. Further discussion on a peace agreement and reunification could not proceed. And the reinvigorated dreams for peace and reunification were not realized. And it's important to note here that North Korea has experienced these kinds of diplomatic failures, not just this one time in 2018-19, but multiple times over past 3 decades due to the United States' disinterest in engaging in meaningful diplomacy. And these failures, combined with the increasingly hostile environment and the multipolarity that Paul mentioned earlier, were just a few of the factors that prompted North Korea to reverse its longstanding position on peaceful reunification. And this has some major implications for the state of peace and the state of war in Korea. And it signals just how far the situation in Korea has devolved. It's both tragic and shameful because it did not have to be this way. And as an organization that has called for peaceful reunification since our inception, we mourn that this dream is moving further from our grasp. But within this new paradigm on the Korean Peninsula, one truth has become very clear. US imperialism is the single greatest threat to safety, peace, and security on the peninsula, and the biggest obstacle to the Korean people's pursuit of true national liberation and sovereignty. And this is why earlier this year, in July, Nodutdol launched the US Out of Korea campaign to call for the end of US imperialism in Korea and to organize greater domestic opposition to US action on the peninsula. We believe that a Korea free of US imperialism, and indeed a world free of imperialism, can be achieved by activating the consciousness of people here in the United States to advance the struggle against US imperialism from within. And we've been honored to receive the support and endorsement of nearly 50 different organizations that represent struggles for national liberation, justice, and to advance the interests of working people. And I'm eager to share a little bit more about the campaign with you with the remaining time that I have, and call on you to join us in this fight. And so I'll be walking through a few of our key demands to give you a sense of what's at stake and why it's so crucial that we unite together as people of conscience under the banner of US Out of Korea. And our first demand calls for the US out of Korea, the full and permanent withdrawal of US troops and weapon systems from Korea, and that all Korean land, water, and airspace appropriated for the US military be returned to the Korean people. You all may be familiar with the history that the US military occupation of Korea stretches back nearly 80 years since the United States divided the peninsula at the 38th parallel and took control of the southern half of Korea from Japanese colonial rule. Today, the US has over 28,000 troops across 62 military bases in Korea, including Camp Humphreys, which you can see on the left-hand side, top left, which is currently the largest military base on foreign soil. The irony is that South Korean taxpayers are on the hook for paying for the US military to occupy their land. In fact, the South Korean government issues $1 billion annually to the US military, and South Korean taxpayers are expected to pay for any environmental damages caused by US military presence. And the United States will state that the military is stationed in Korea to protect South Korea and its people from North Korea's aggression, especially as the Korean War remains unresolved. But that is simply not true. The United States maintains its military presence in South Korea to have a foothold and a geographically strategic position in order to advance its own interests and to use South Korea as a convenient launch pad from which to wage regional war in Asia. And US imperialism on the peninsula isn't just limited to the US troops and weapon systems stationed there. It also extends to the joint command structures and military alliances between both the US and South Korea. And that's why our second demand calls for an end to the US-South Korea alliance and an end to all US-South Korea joint command structures. Under these command structures, the US has wartime operational control of South Korea's military. In effect, meaning that in an event of war, a US general will be able to maneuver all 3.6 million of South Korea's armed forces, which I want to note is the largest and most powerful out of the US's allies in Asia. And the military alliances extend beyond just the US and South Korea to include other allied nations in Asia. Because as you may know, last year, Biden, along with South Korea's Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, announced the Japan-South Korea-US trilateral military alliance that explicitly names as a primary target and threat to the security of the region. And JACUS is just one of several new alliances that the United States has spearheaded. The US has established similar strategic multilateral partnerships with the Philippines, the UK, and Japan, you can see on the left, between the US, Australia, and the UK, which you can see on the top right corner, and something called the Quad, between Australia, US, Japan, and India. And the US hopes to consolidate these alliances into an Asian version of NATO, to both project its power and show its military might in the region, its ability to maneuver and call on these allies, and also form a military bloc that can prepare for war against North Korea, certainly, and also against China as part of their push for a new Cold War. And as I gestured to earlier, due to the United States' dangerous military brinkmanship past few years, the possibility of war in Korea is becoming more and more likely. And that's why the last demand that I'll share with you today calls for an end to all aggression against North Korea, including the cessation of all US military exercises and the lifting of all sanctions. You've heard this statistic earlier in the presentation, but I think it bears repeating. Last year, the United States held 200 days of war drills. And this year, the war drills have been similarly unrelenting and unprecedented in scale. The US and South Korea have begun rehearsing scenarios that would prove catastrophic for the Korean people and the entire world. Just last year, the US and South Korea established the Nuclear Consultative Group, which aims to discuss joint nuclear planning and draft plans to combine South Korean conventional weapons with the US's nuclear arsenal. And in late July, they conducted a series of tabletop exercises called Iron Mace 24 to rehearse scenarios of nuclear war, including the possible use of a nuclear weapon on the Korean peninsula. Now, when you hear the notion of tabletop exercises, it can be easy to imagine that they were playing soldier with a bunch of toy figurines. But I trust that you'll understand the gravity of the situation. They would not be drafting plans nor practicing scenarios of dropping a nuke on Korea if they were not prepared to follow through with it. And just a few weeks after Iron Mace 24, the US and South Korea jointly conducted their annual Ulji Freedom Shield exercises, which were larger than ever, involving 19,000 South Korean troops and 48 field training events across 11 days. And even before Ulji Freedom Shield had fully concluded, the US and South Korea began another set of multi-day military exercises called Sangyong off the eastern coast of the peninsula, this time with a special focus on joint maritime capabilities and amphibious landings to rehearse invading North Korea. And I want to pause here just to emphasize that the three military exercises that I've highlighted, Iron Mace 24, the Ulji Freedom Shield exercises, and the Sangyong exercises essentially happened within the course of 1 month between July and August. The Korean people do not want war. But what I hope is evident is that the US and South Korean ruling classes have been ceaseless in their reckless pursuit of war. And with each new day of heightened war games, the United States provokes and prods North Korea. And through these drills, the US also increases its and its allies' capabilities to go to war. Again, not only with North Korea, but also in the possibility of a regional conflict with China. And if war were to break out, it is the masses of people, including Koreans, who will serve as cannon fodder, and our homelands that would emerge as one of the key battlefields. After launching the campaign in July, one of our first coordinated actions was to rally against the cascade of US military exercises and proclaim no to nuclear war in Korea. Between August 15th to the 18th, we, alongside our partner organizations, mobilized hundreds of people across Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco to demand an end to US militarization and provocations of war. We united with many people struggling for their freedom from imperialist oppression, including organizations representing the liberation of Palestine, Philippines, Cuba, Venezuela, and many more. And we were not alone in these efforts. Our compatriots in South Korea similarly called for an end to all US military exercises in Korea. And you can see, I'll be sharing a short clip of it now. And please let me know if the sound doesn't work. We've been heartened and galvanized by the moment and the growing wave of consciousness that we've been able to witness here in the United States. However, we know that our work cannot end with just one action or one webinar. We must continue to strive towards raising the anti-imperialist consciousness of those in our midst, and we believe that it is our duty to advance the struggle within the United States as one key front of the fight against US imperialism, not only in Korea, but in all places and locales that imperialist oppression touches. And to conclude my presentation, Alan, do I have time? I see you're unmuted. Okay,
Yes.
great. To conclude my presentation, I'd like to show a short clip of Im Soon-bun, who is an activist that we met in South Korea in one of our delegation trips, who's been protesting against THAAD for the past 7 years, an American weapon system stationed in South Korea. And I hope her testimony helps to clarify and summarize the unrestrained brutality of the imperialist regime and the true desires of the Korean people. And you should have be able to see subtitles on the bottom for translation.
저는 이 마을 주민이고요. 지금 현재 마을의 부녀회장을 맡고 있고, 이 마을에 산 지는 한 45년 살고 있습니다. 현재 나이는 70이고요. 이름은 임순분입니다. 예전에 이 마을은 그냥 말 그대로 전형적인 시골 마을로 농사만 짓고 살던 곳이에요. 시원할 때 아침 저녁으로 일하고 더운 한낮에 더울 때는 이렇게 마을 해관에 모여서 주민들이 좀 쉬기도 하고 이렇게 지내왔었는데 사드가 들어오고 난 이후에 주민들의 일상이 확 바뀌어버린 게 매일 여기 와서 이 길에서 미군들 들어가는 거 막아야 되고 기름차 들어가는 거 막아야 되고 일하러 들어가는 인부들 가서 공사하지 말라고 막아야 되고 이렇게 하는데 일주일에 5일을 싸워야 돼요. 그렇게 싸우다가 주민들이 너무 힘이 들어서 지금은 일주일에 주민들은 이틀 하고 그 대신에 일주일에 또 이틀은 오전 오후에 2번씩 미군들이 기름차를 몰고 들어가. 이거를 막느라고 지금처럼 이게 더운 날씨에 오전 11시부터 12시 사이에 그 기름차를 막다가 경찰한테 끌려 나오고 오후 또 2시에서 3시, 4시 사이에 또 한 번 이렇게 나가는 차량을 막는데 또 끌려 나오고 이거를 매일 반복을 하고 있어요. 얼마 전에도 제가 2달 전에 장갑차 나가는 걸 막다가 경찰들한테 끌려 나가고 병원 치료를 받은 적이 있어요. 네. 주민들이 그때 2명 다쳤거든. 네.
지금도 아프세요? 아니면
몸
네, 그때 다치신 거 괜찮으세요?
아파요.
아, 어디?
그때 경찰들한테 돌려서 해갖고 제가 거기서 넘어졌거든요. 넘어지면서 어깨하고 이제 허리를 다쳐버렸는데 지금도 이 허리 부분이 통증이 와서 또 조만간 치료를 받아야 돼. 그때 받다가 치료를 중단했거든요. 중단했는데 지금 현재 제가 치료를 받아야 될 상황이고 사드 들어오고 나서 제가 다친 횟수가 수십 번이 넘어요. 네.
미국 정부한테 하고 싶은 말 있어요?
네. 그냥 우리끼리 살도록 그냥 가만 냅둬라. 제발 좀 건드리지 마라. 우리는 우리끼리도 충분히 행복하고 싸우지 않고 북한과 등지고 이렇게 살아갈 이유가 없어요. 미국만 개입 안 하면 남북 통일해서 잘 살아. 그냥 미국 정부는 자기네들 나라 일이나 신경 쓰고 하고 우리나라는 그냥 자유롭게 살도록 그냥 가만 냅둬라. 저는 이 부탁 드리고 싶어요.
So to end, I hope that you join us in this effort and answer this call for you to be part of this movement and to get the US out of Korea. So we have a few calls to action for you at this time. If you're part of an organization, please consider endorsing our campaign. You can also join our email list to receive updates about our campaign, including upcoming events, and some that are on the horizon. If you are in LA, San Francisco, or New York, we'll be mobilizing for the 1 year of genocide, 1 year of resistance on October 5th or October 6th. And we invite you to join our Korea contingent. And we'll also be hosting some educational events this fall, and you'll be able to find out more if you are on our email listserv. And finally, what I want to say is what I was able to provide was a very brief overview of our campaign and the conditions that led to it. And so if you're interested in learning more, we do have a recording that details a bit more about what is happening in Korea, and you can find that YouTube link in the chat that I'll share here. And thank you so much for this time, and I'll pass it back to you, Alan.
Thank you so much. Excellent presentation, Jeeho and Paul. Really appreciate it. If you could drop those links into the chat, that would be great because it would give people the opportunity to sign up for your email list and to get notified about events and actions that you're going to be taking. That would be great. Okay, so from here, what we're going to do is just take a short break for announcements. I want to tell you about our upcoming programs. We have a program next Sunday, September 29th, again at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. We're going to have an open discussion on the upcoming election. We want to encourage everybody to come to the session and bring up your ideas, your questions, your comments about what's going on in relation to the election that's coming up in about a month. And it should be a good discussion. On Sunday, October 6th, again at 10:30 a.m. Pacific time, we are going to have an update on recent developments in Germany. And this is going to be a very, very special session and presentation. We're going to have as our guest speaker from Eastern Germany, Victor Grossman, who was born in 1928 and is an American journalist, writer, and popular speaker who defected to the USSR in 1952. And he has since lived in East Germany and then the reunified Germany, chronicling life, politics, and humanity in the former socialist state. He's going to be talking about the election, recent developments, a lot of changes in Germany going on today, too. We want to remind you that you can sign up for email notifications for our programs at ICSSmarks.org. That's ICSSmarks.org, where you can find links to video recordings of our past programs and contact us with feedback, suggestions for speakers, programs, and topics, and make a donation to support our Sunday morning program. What we want to do now is ask anybody who has a question or a comment, to raise your hand by going to the bottom of your Zoom window and the reactions button and raise your hand. And we're going to try to get everybody in today to ask questions and receive comments. We generally take one question at a time. And please be patient, everybody, with getting called on. We're going to try to get everybody in. So with that, let's start with our first person. Let's take citizen one. If you would unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Yes, thank you both for that. That was very interesting. Okay, so I have disparate notes I jotted down real fast. So I'm going to interlace my brief comments with my brief questions, and you can take on any of the questions as you wish. So I believe that the U.S. does not want to see a united Korea. And I believe one of the reasons why, besides the fact that the U.S. would have to lessen its military spending there, is because a united Korea, I believe, the U.S. would see as a greater economic threat, because they would be able to, Korea would be able to combine the resources of the North and the South. I believe, that the U.S. Is ratcheting up spending for its military-industrial complex, and that's why it's been involved in all these agitations across the world, like in Ukraine, like with regard to Taiwan, and also all these U.S. military exercises in Korea. I'm wondering if the U.S. is still in government, is still in operational control of the U.S. military. I'll wrap up by saying, I don't know to what extent you're aware of it, but from what I saw, Hillary used to threaten North Korea about every other month, which was like really stupid because then she'd have to back down. And I never believed, I was unpopular for this in the East Bay among the Korean American community in Oakland and at UC Berkeley. But I never believed that Trump was going to attack North Korea in spite of all his saber rattlings. There was a joke that the closer you got to South Korea, the less South Koreans were worried about a nuclear war. They were like, we've heard it all before. And I just believe that the ramifications of a U.S. attack on North Korea, could involve the deaths of millions of people within the first 24 hours. And I was a lone person that I knew of, besides the Pentagon, to know that that just wasn't going to happen. My last point is that I saw a sign in one of your photos, U.S. missile defense out of Asia. And while I'm all for that, I think that that is so unlikely as to discredit the sign holder. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean, why not just say U.S. missile defense out of the world? I think just U.S. missile defense out of South Korea and take any U.S. nukes that are there on offshore ships or ported ships would be a far more bite-sized thing to accomplish. And what is the state of this in South Korea? So I'm sorry for all my disparate points. I was jotting down notes real fast while you were talking. Thank you.
I think you meant is the U.S. still in military control of the South Korean forces, if I'm not
Yes,
mistaken?
I did.
Yeah.
If I spoke, that's what I meant. I'm sorry.
Okay. I'm not sure how to do this, but either of you want to unmute and respond, please go ahead. Both have to unmute, though, for us to hear you.
Go ahead, Jeeho.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Citizen of the Planet One, for your questions. I think one thing that I wanted to bring attention to was your comment about the fact that the U.S. is advancing its wars across the world in order to continue the profits that it sees from its military. And actually, one of the last demands that we have for the campaign, which I wasn't really able to share due to time, is to end the war economy and to end all military spending abroad, which we know that ultimately kind of just ends up lining the pockets of war profiteers and the imperialist class, in order to redistribute and rethink how we fund critical systems of housing, healthcare, and education, things that people need to thrive. And so just wanted to call attention to that because I wasn't able to highlight that. And one of the questions that you asked was regarding the ROK movement. As one of the videos that I was able to show indicate, there is a desire amongst the Korean people to call attention to the effects of U.S. military presence in Korea, and to call for the removal of, weapon systems and bases. And so definitely some of the demands that we do have in the campaign align with their calls as well. And we hope to kind of continue to build our solidarity and our connection with the movement on the ground, because they are bearing the brunt of U.S. imperialism on Korea themselves. So I'll keep my comments there. Yeah.
Paul, if you have anything to add.
Well, a couple of things. The position of the Biden administration and Yoon Suk-yeol that Korea should be reunified, but under a liberal regime. So if it's basically reunification by virtue of regime change in the North. And then in terms of the U.S. control over the armed forces of Korea, that in wartime, the United States has operational control over South Korean military forces, which is another way of saying that it just has operational control, period. Because in that, I think it's significant that it seems like instead of trying to bring Korea and Japan into NATO, the decision seems to be that the United States has far more control, over the armed forces of Korea and actually also Japan than they do over anything in Europe. Because although a U.S. General is a supreme Allied command in Europe, he is reporting to a huge political structure uh, composed of 31 different countries with competing interests. And it's something that makes the prosecution of a NATO war extremely complicated. But it's not complicated at all in Korea because the United States retains supreme control over the entire forces of South Korea and has recently agreed with Japan to upgrade the U.S. Command in Japan to a third star general to better coordinate, a response with the Japanese defense forces in time of war. So, and plus the United States is providing a nuclear umbrella over both Korea and Japan. So the United States is just like supreme military leader in Northeast Asia, and it's going down that road. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Next is Norma, followed by Richard. Norma, if you would ask your question, please.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. And greetings to the people who are working so hard for such a difficult issue to be met. If you've had a chance to notice, I posted about the article I read in Harper's. Harper's used to be a very valuable publication for thinking about stuff. And I don't know if I can trust it with the report that they made here on travels along the demilitarized zone and the horrors that they met with. We, like the Communist Party and so forth, all are supporters of North Korea. And it becomes complicated when this kind of information is disseminated. And so if you have anything that you can tell me now, or I put my email in the chat, and you are able to respond to that substantially about what that, I'm going to look for a way to send you the article because accessing Harper's, of course, requires passport and all that kind of stuff. But to take it from me that the article was talking about the terrible things that North Korea does. I don't know if it said something like stripping the skin off of people that they catch, but it was that level of horrification of the people. And I want some substance to say other than I know that those are not sufficient. Thank you. And thank you both for all this fine work you do.
Paul, do you want to, or Jeeho, do you want to? Paul, why don't you respond?
I haven't read the Harper's article, but there are a lot of horror stories published using defectors as a source of information for their experiences in trying to escape North Korea, what happens to them upon return to North Korea, and so forth. It's hard to parse through all of that. I would caution, that if defectors are being used as a primary source, for information that's being publicized about North Korean border policy, I think that, people have to be cautioned that that defectors, have generally been used as a source of propaganda by the South Korean government. That said, we know from the stories of people who are, for example, traveling through the Darien Pass, trying to get to the United States, that they face, migrants face certain horrors universally when they are forced to flee their countries for whatever reason. Sexual predation, exploitation by coyotes and traffickers, death along the trail. These are things that we read about every day. But what we don't read about is, the source of the cause of this kind of migration that's going on in the world today, whether it's in Northeast Asia, whether it's in the Middle East, or in Central and South America. It's essentially all these countries that have US sanctions, NATO sanctions, that the United States is trying to bring to its knees, are having massive migration out of their countries. This includes most recently Venezuelans, Cubans, and for over a decade now, this outpouring of migrants who are trying to flee to Europe across the Mediterranean from Libya. North Korea during the worst of its famine years in the 1990s, there were about estimated 200,000 North Korean who fled to Manchuria, in search of being able to just survive. And at this point in time, the plight of North Korean slow defectors was in the news every day. But once North Korea got back on its feet, those 200,000 North Korean migrants, they by and large went back to North Korea to be with their families. And really, when China started cracking down on North Koreans crossing that border into that territory, is when these traffickers and and to a large extent religious communities along that border began to weaponize the travels of the plight of these immigrants as a means of bashing North Korea and China. And that is really when they tend to clamp down on the border crossings. But for most of this period of time, North Koreans have, basically gone back over the border and back into Korea. Many of them bringing goods that they purchase in Manchuria and sell in the markets in North Korea. And actually, it has become a source of income for what is being touted as the rise of the middle class in North Korea. People who make their money as merchants peddling products from China. So I think it's a very complex issue. I'm not going to say that, that this is all fabricated, but I want to say also that I think it needs to be, that the solution or to the end of whatever plight these people are suffering, at least in the case of Korea, has to be the lifting of sanctions against North Korea, and ultimately the peaceful reconciliation of both societies and their eventual intercourses, two economies that need each other badly. So I would not be deterred in my support for a peaceful reunification by any stories that I read in Harper's or whatever.
Jeeho, do you have a comment on this?
Can I say one line of affirmation of what he just told us? And I'm grateful of being reminded about the tortuous situation that occurs to people being so terribly assaulted. That's been going on since the USSR, where people have been trying to survive the revolution and so on, and they've gone out and they've come back. They came back in huge numbers, which was not reported exceptionally. And this is going on in many places where people are trying to deal with the new circumstances. Thank you.
Jeeho, did you have a comment?
No, I just wanted to say that I echo Paul's statement about, just thinking through a little bit more about, the conditions that do lead to these defections. And I haven't read this article, Norma, but once I read it and I have any other kind of insights or comments, I'll be sure to email you.
Okay, next is Richard, followed by Raj. And I want to encourage everybody, this is a real opportunity to ask questions and get information to cut through the propaganda wall that we have in this country on Korea, which is probably the thickest wall that we face in terms of information without exaggeration. So please click on the reactions button, raise your hand, raise your questions, make your comments. Richard, if you would proceed.
Yeah, thank you. And you're right, Alan. I think it's the longest ongoing war that we've been experiencing. So way back when, back when I was in University of Oregon, I was a member of a Korean Information and Action Project. And strange as it may sound, it was basically we were advocating for the reunification of and peaceful reunification of the Koreans. And that was 40, 50 years ago now. And I'm seeing the same things, and I can't help but wonder if maybe we need to reevaluate. Like a lot of this is based on the ability to petition the government for change, and I can't help but wonder if maybe we've reached the end of that. One and two, a lot of these actions are centered in the major cities. So my question is how are you approaching getting out of the major cities? What means of communication are you exploiting or going after? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Maybe Jeeho, if you want to start with that, and then we'll go to Paul if he has any comment.
Sure. And thank you so much, Richard, for your two questions. I think to respond to the first regarding, the limitations of appealing to the existing kind of political apparatuses of elected officials, I think something that we have been contemplating internally and certainly have been thinking about is the fact that in just over a month, we're due to have another kind of presidential election and decide between, Trump and Harris, the Republicans and Democrats. And I think something that we've identified is that regardless of who becomes elected, their approach to Korea may differ, but they will still represent the interests of the imperialist ruling class. They will still continue to want to profit off of war abroad. And so for us, we've been thinking about how we can build political power that is not only contained within the political system that we do have, the electoral system that we do have here, as a means to still drum up and build that domestic political opposition to US imperialism in Korea. And in terms of the second question that you asked in regards to how we're going to kind of reach out to other places besides major cities? It's a really great question, and indeed something that we are also contemplating at this time. Right now, our main kind of bases are New York, San Francisco, and LA, but we do hope to expand further, not just as an organization, but really work together across the over 50 different endorsing organizations in order to bring the US Out of Korea campaign to where they are, because we know that our allies have a reach that's much more extensive. And so we're very grateful for their solidarity and look to build with them to kind of think about and strategize how we can bring that, bring these calls to places where we might not be present yet. So I'll leave my comments there. And if Paul, if you have any thoughts or response to that.
Well, the Korea Policy Institute sees itself as being an educational institute. And from my point of view, when I was in college years ago, there was a real dearth of information about Korea and in particular about North Korea. The writings about North Korea were pretty much dominated by CIA-sponsored scholars. So I sort of see the role that the Policy Institute playing is actually establishing a source of information, alternative information about Korea, North and South Korea, U.S. policy towards Korea that, if people can go to when they have questions about what's going on. We maintain a website and we collect articles and that we think are insightful about Korea. We do our own writing. We're supporting a collective of Korean American scholars that have formed a End the War teaching collective, and we are hosting their work on our website. And more so, but maybe going in the future, before the pandemic, we did more speaking and organizing of actual in-person conferences, and perhaps we'll do that. So I'll end with that.
Paul, if you could drop contact information or the website or whatever in the chat for the KPI, the Korea Policy Institute, that would be great.
Sure.
I think people would like to sign up for that.
Sure.
Next up is Raj, followed by Jean. So Raj, if you would unmute and go ahead.
First of all, Paul and Jeeho, thank you very much. Very informative presentation. I have two questions. First is that it seems like a very strong defense pact between North Korea and Russia now. And is there such a pact between North Korea and China? So that's first question. The second is Trump went tremendously changing tried to change U.S. policy towards North Korea. And he's again a candidate. Of course, he failed because he lost and, nothing got done. The greater power in the U.S. state prevailed. But now he's a candidate again. And on the other side is Kamala Harris. So how do you see, and you've said they're both imperialists, which I agree, but how do you see, is there a difference in terms of Korea policy, whether one comes or the other? So those are my two questions. Thank you. Thank you very much.
I guess Paul will take you first this time. We'll go back and forth. So Paul, please. If you want to respond on the Russia question, perhaps first.
So there is a clause in the strategic partnership, which was in my PowerPoint, where the two sides pledge to come up to each other's aids if one comes under attack. So there is an alliance or relationship similar between China and North Korea, but it does not have that sort of, if I get attacked, then you're going to, jump into the fray on my side. There's there's a lot more ambiguity in terms of, how China would relate to, to North Korea as an ally if North Korea were to be attacked. And the other part of Roger's question was what?
Well, how do you see a difference between Trump coming back to power, who had made a quite significant effort to diffuse the Korea tension by, making approach to Kim Jong-un, and then now he's coming back. So how do you see the difference between his approach versus Kamala Harris in terms of policy?
I tend to think that Kamala Harris would be like a kind of a reboot of the Obama Biden. I don't know what they strategic patience or do nothing or just continue to threaten and hope that the status quo can be maintained. Trump, I think, assuming that he wants to pick up some dialogue with Kim Jong Un, North Korea, I think the North Koreans will talk to him. But I think the North Koreans have also made it clear that that diplomacy and personal relations are things that need to be kept separate, and that after Trump went before the Republican convention and talked about how North Korea loves him, that Kim Jong Un loves him, North Korean came out and said, well, actually, Trump didn't really do anything for us. And, it's really not about the personal relationship between leaders, but it's really about our relationship with the United States. And then Kim Jong-un has also made some statement over the summer saying that, the reason why they're moving forward with their, present course on not negotiating with the United States is because, he feels that the position of the United States towards North Korea is something that the North Korean people are going to have to deal with for many generations to come. So I don't think they're seeing this as a, as a solution for their problems. But it is very interesting, though, that I think the North Koreans have really decided that rather than pursuing a diplomatic rapprochement with the United States as the basis for their approach to reunification, they're going to go. They are all in, on this multipolar movement that is being led principally by Russia at this point. They're all in on Russia's pushback of NATO and Ukraine, and they will aid the Russians, I believe, in any way that they feel that is appropriate for them to do so. So I think in the long run, they're thinking that the future of Korea really lies in the establishment of a multipolar world. Now, in the short run, what's going to happen in Korea tomorrow? Well, a lot of that will depend on who is president, in the United States come next year. And I think they'll deal with whoever that is, Kamala Harris as Trump, from a position of, what are you going to do for us to get us to do anything for you? And principally, I think that means that if the North Koreans are going to open up any kind of meaningful dialogue with the United States has to be willing to lift its sanctions against its country and to drop its demand that the North Koreans denuclearize. Barring that, I don't see it going anywhere in terms of.
May I just a quick follow-up on that? So do you see Trump as more accommodating to multipolarity than Kamala Harris yourself? Do you see that? And therefore, more possibility of Korean, at least tension reducing in the Korean Peninsula? Do you see that?
I don't think he's committed to multipolarity. I think he's committed to what is transactionally beneficial to his presidency. And I think that
Paul, you might want to pull your mic out a little bit. I think you're
Yeah, I couldn't hear your response. I'm sorry.
Sorry. I don't think he's committed to multipolarity as a political outlook. I think he's basically transactional in terms of, whatever best deal he can get for his presidency. So I don't think, I think that his position on multipolarity, I think, is best seen in statement he's made about BRICS and the movement to de-dollarize. And he has made statements to the effect that we will somehow sanction or punish countries that seek to use their own currencies as opposed to using the dollar. Well, that right there is about as unipolar as you can get. So, no, I don't see him as being like the great white savior of, of the global South. And actually, he will destroy. I mean, he will devastate Palestine. Anyhow, that's all I'll say about Trump.
Jeeho, would you like to comment on both aspects of Roger's two questions?
Yeah, I can comment a little bit about the question regarding Trump. I think it's a good question. I think we can expect, or the current understanding that I have is if Harris were to be elected, she would probably continue the same kind of approach and strategy that we've been seeing from Biden. I think what's interesting with Trump is who in his camp would be advocating for a different kind of approach with Korea. I think there's a sector, kind of a group within his camp who might suggest, renegotiating the Mutual Defense Treaty with Korea, to lessen the obligation of the US to defend in a war against North Korea if that were to come about, and to really focus on war with China if that were to break out, to expect that the South Korea government actually pay more for the stationing of US military within South Korea, and also potentially even crucially negotiate with North Korea, and potentially reduce tensions. But I think, regardless of some of these changes that might appear to align with some of our campaign demands, crucially the renegotiating the Mutual Defense Treaty, I think it's important to understand that, Trump and his camp are really just trying to find a way to advance their own interests and maximize how much they're able to gain from their allies. So to reduce the kind of responsibility or the entanglement that they have in Korea, and to be able to start to focus on a little bit more clearly on a potential conflict with China. And I think that's kind of the reading that I've been having, or my understanding has been, just having a sense of who is in Trump's camp, particularly this camp of conservative realists, who are pushing for a different kind of approach to Korea than we might understand Harris's approach, but still isn't really in the interests of the Korean people, and certainly not in the certainly still advancing for the cause of US imperialism there. So I hope that clarifies a little bit what some of those distinctions are. And I just wanted to also give a disclaimer that, we can make suppositions or anticipate what might happen based on what has been revealed right now. And we also won't be able to firmly understand what that approach will be, probably until later.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Jean, followed by Janet. And before we move on, I just want to remind people there's a lot of interest in the election. So come back next week, sign up at ICSSmarks.org and participate in our discussion where these questions and others related to the election are going to be discussed. So Jean, please unmute.
I am unmuted, am I not?
Yeah, we hear
Okay,
you.
great. Well, I just want to thank both of our speakers and and Alan for setting this up. I think this is a really important issue. It's been neglected. Other things are in the news, and it's time we do spend more time on this in terms of the importance of Korea. And I want to say I'm a member of Veterans for Peace, which is a educational humanitarian organization dedicated to the abolishment of war. And looking at your demands, I think we're ready just to endorse those. There's really good demands that have to be made. And so thank you for putting those forward, and may be back in contact to talk to you more about that. But the other thing I just want to mention, I did my research, so doctoral research on Japan. And, the Japanese traditionally have regarded the Koreans as an inferior race. And I think about the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, the rape of Nanjing, other kinds of things, and also the comfort women that they would go out and, quote, recruit Japanese or Korean girls from the countryside, rape them, and then sell them to these brothels. And I understand that there's a monument in San Francisco to the sufferings of the comfort women statue there. And again, I just wanted to congratulate you on your work, but also if you have anything to say about the comfort women and that really horrible chapter in our history. Thank you.
Okay, Jeeho, if you would respond first, unmute.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jean, for your question. And excited to hear that Veterans for Peace would be, supportive of our campaign and our demands. I think in terms of your question, it is quite shameful that Yoon has entered into this agreement with Japan and the US. And as part of it, I think pretty much allowed Japan to not apologize for the true brutality that they showcased as part of as part of their kind of colonial era rule. And I think, this is a topic of continued contention, I understand, within Japan and certainly within South Korea. And so I think from my end, I think I truly believe that they do need to, apologize for the crimes that they committed, but no one is keeping them accountable for it. And in fact, the South Korean president, who is supposed to act in the interests of the Korean people and is supposed to enforce Supreme Court rulings in Korea, in order to have Japan apologize and pay reparations, is not enforcing any of those. And so I think it just goes to show just how little Yoon regards the wishes of his own people, and certainly the kind of puppetry that I would say is happening currently in Korea, with Biden kind of maneuvering both Korea and Japan to come into this alliance. So I hope that that helps clarify. And I think Myeon in the chat also highlighted that the comfort woman system didn't end once the Japanese left, that the South Korean government took the system on and maintained it as part of a system of camp towns for the US military. So I think we need to also note that as well.
And of course, we have our own homegrown sex trafficking right here in the United States, which gained some attention recently. Thank you.
Paul, did you have a comment?
I think the only comment I have is that within the JCIS, or the U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral formation, there's a pecking order. And the pecking order is, Korea is low man on the totem pole, and Japan is next up. And this gets enforced, or this gets expressed in these negotiations between South Korea and Japan over these issues, like the comfort women and reparations for the use of Koreans as slave labor by Imperial Japan. It's expressed in the form of Japan simply denying any sort of redress that's acceptable to Korea for those issues. And Yoon Suk Yeol simply saying, okay. Okay. I mean, basically, that Yoon is, basically said, all right, not an issue. Let's go on and be friends. And then it is also sort of premised in the U.S.-Japan security arrangement, where the defense forces that are defined as being in existence to defend the sovereignty of Japan. Also, the United States would recognize, that Korea falls within a security interest of Japan. And the notion that Korea is a spear that points to Japan, that Japan would need to be able to defend itself from that kind of threat. So it reminds me a little bit of the Takatsura Agreement, where Teddy Roosevelt agreed that Korea would fall within Japan's sphere of interest, and that Japan would recognize U.S. interests in the Philippines. So Korea is still there as a security concern for Japan, as recognized in this trilateral security arrangement. That's all I'll say.
Okay, next is Janet, followed by Richard, and then I'm going to try to poke a question there if we have time. So Janet, please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. Much appreciation, Paul and Jeeho, for your presentations and for your work. As you know, there are African countries, especially in the Sahel, that have been fighting to decolonize and remove American and European military bases there. Has the U.S. out of Korea campaign supported any of these endeavors? And would you talk about the common elements of the anti-colonization struggles and the American presence in Korea? And also, I have a friend who fought in the Korean War. I assume there were organizations formed back then of U.S. veterans against the Korean War. And if so, if they still exist, do you work with any of them? Perhaps Jean might also weigh in on this vis-a-vis Veterans for Peace. Thank you.
Paul, do you want to go ahead and respond to that? The first question about the involvement, or I don't know. I don't know who's more appropriate. Maybe because it was directed more about the campaign. So Jeeho, why don't you unmute?
Great. Thank you so much, Janet, for your question. And I think in terms of our involvement and solidarity with folks fighting for U.S. out of Africa, I think one of our campaign endorsers is the Black Alliance for Peace, which I know does some work around that. I think to the second part of your question in regards to the similarities between, some of the struggles within the Sahel and Korea, I need to do more reading on that. I'm finding that's definitely a point of education for myself, and so I'll definitely kind of do that after this webinar. But I think at this time, that's kind of all I have to offer. And I think can you remind me what your second question was?
whether there are organizations that were formed, Veterans Against the Korean War, and if they still exist, or are they just part of Veterans for Peace?
Yeah, I am not personally aware of specific organizations, but I'm not sure, Paul, if you have any knowledge on that front.
I'm not aware of. When we've had programs, we have generally worked with Vets for Peace in terms of getting speakers. There are not a lot of vets of the Korean War that we've been in contact with. So in general, when we've marched with Vets for Peace and we've done programs with Vets for Peace, I don't know, although we have not worked with any Korean Vets for Peace as an organization. And then we do not have any direct connection with the movements in the Sahel, but philosophically we support anti-colonial movements in Africa and wherever. And certainly we're very happy to see that these countries are taking back their sovereignty from the United States, and it's certainly inspiring for us who would like to do this in Korea.
If I could add on that, there is Vietnam Vets Against the War, and also more recently with the Middle East, Iraq vets and so on. As going back to the Korean War, that was a little bit, there was less consciousness, I think, within the American body politic. But one of our comrades, Elazar, which we all know, I think, was participating in that. And I think he would know more than I do about the resistance to American involvement in the Korean War. But that's a good question, and it deserves a better answer, I think. Thank you.
Okay, Richard, Richard F., if you would please go ahead.
Well, I wonder if you'd comment a little bit on the economies of North and South Korea. I mean, generally the image that's projected is of North Korea being a basket case and South Korea being one of the most ferocious of the Asian giants, tigers, I guess you could say. And I wonder if that's still true. What's changing, if you could say on that.
Paul, maybe you could comment on that.
Well, North Korea is a socialist economy, and South Korea is a capitalist economy. And
Paul, can you hold your mic up a little bit so we can hear you better?
Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
South Korea is a capitalist country. I would say it's very difficult to compare the two economies. In the early 90s, when North Korea went through its famine, a few years later, South Korea went through its own economic crisis, the IMF crisis. These two crises manifest themselves in different ways. In North Korea, the crisis was a result of loss of production. They lost the energy basis of their economy when China and then Soviet Union started selling oil to North Korea at market prices, and which they could not afford. And so the famine was a direct result of not being able to produce food for people to eat, not being able to clear the roads and the mines and the fields from the flooding that occurred in 95 and 96. In South Korea, nothing happened to the infrastructure of the society. The roads were there. There was no flooding. There was no natural calamity, but people didn't have money. without money, they couldn't purchase anything. So it's not like there were not commodities there, but they were not accessible to the South Korean people, nor to South Korean businesses, and at that point, not even to the chaebol, because the South Korean economy had been built on the basis of loans. And when those loans were called in, they were so overextended, they didn't have the ability to pay it. So, I mean, these are two crises of a different nature, but both very serious. So, if you're going to look at North Korea, and you can't really evaluate it by its per capita income, because in socialist society, the drive is to minimize the size of wage and to compensate that wage by the growth of public services. Those public services are all people's property, so they don't count as part of an independent earnings of a South Korean worker. So you don't actually see that. In North Korea, or generally speaking, an army is a huge debit on any economy. So in the US, military spending, South Korea military spending is basically is onerous on society. It doesn't produce anything for the society. But in North Korea, the army actually is productive. So although we say that, well, North Korea is spending all this money on its army, how can it do that when it should be spending all its money on feeding its people? Actually, by spending all this money on their army, they're able to feed their people, because it's their army that actually, dug the fields out of, dug the mud out of all its fields, and is actually building all the houses for all these folks that lost their houses in the flooding in North Korea last summer. So it is a productive force. So, it's hard to say on an overall basis which society is doing better. South Korea has a birth rate of 0.7% according to the United Nations. North Korea's birth rate is 1.7%. So not 1.7%, is 1.7 births per family. So that's still not enough to maintain a population, but it's twice as high as it is in South Korea, and it's actually higher than it is in Japan. So who knows? I mean, I can't really give you a quantitative answer to your question, but it's very challenging to understand the nature of crises in both societies, and also the level of wealth in both societies. At least in North Korea, the little that people have, they own, because it's all people's property. But in South Korea, nobody owns anything. I mean, household debt exceeds gross domestic product. So who's to say? But South Korea is probably a more fun place to go. If you're from the West and you have money to spend.
Jeeho, if you have a quick comment, that'd be great. We're getting close to the end. No? Okay. Okay. Actually, I just want to say that there's been an ongoing, a lot of interest to have a session on North Korea, on life, economy, politics, culture, society. And I'd like to invite you guys to come back and do a program on that. It's so important because there's so much demonization. The propaganda it's relentless and ubiquitous. And we've got to at least try to cut through it. So please consider coming back and doing a session specifically on North Korea. I have a quick question. I think it's actually on an important topic I want to raise to both of you. Can you comment, about Raj had earlier raised the question about the relations between North Korea, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and Russia as part of multipolarity. But there are other aspects of this. Can you comment a little bit about the actions and activities of North Korea in other struggles like Palestine, Venezuela, and other aspects of multipolarity and the resistance front to U.S. imperialism on a political, military, and economic level. Just briefly comment on that because we have to wrap up real soon. So either of you, maybe Jeeho, if you want to go ahead and take a turn, or Paul. I'm not.
Yeah, I can keep it very, very brief because I know that we are running out of time. I just want to say that North Korea has been in solidarity and in full support of Palestinian liberation for a very long time. And in fact, North Korea had supported the Palestinian Liberation Organization, including, sending amounts of arms and military aid to Palestine as part of that struggle. And so, I think there's a lot of untold histories about the different kinds of linkages and relationships between different kind of struggles across the world. And I think the foray into learning more about the relationship between Palestine and North Korea is truly interesting because it's a testament to the kind of international solidarity that peoples of the third world have had and continue to have now as the genocide against the Palestinian people in this outrageous iteration continues into its 11th month. So I'll keep my comment there, but thank you for raising that question.
Paul, do you have a quick response to that?
No, I agree with Jeeho. It's a large topic in and of itself. North Korea has historically been a huge militant supporter of national liberation movements across the third world. And it's a subject that that needs more. We need to know more about, but yeah.
Easy to understand why. Let's say last point, I think Rich J, we're actually over. So Rich, if you would, since you haven't asked any questions, if you would unmute and please ask a quick question because we need to wrap up.
I almost never hear this talked, well, never hear this talked about. But when I first learned about Korea, second learned about Korea in 1970, I was there in 61, South Korea. I went up to the 38th parallel, had no idea what the heck was going on, but I was 16 years old. But in 1970, 71, 72, I met a fellow named Andy Truskier, worked for International Bulletin. And through him and the work that International Bulletin, who was based in Berkeley, the work they did, I learned a little bit about Juche, I'll call it the philosophy or the politics of Kim Il-sung. And I never hear anyone talk about it. And would either one of you say anything about it at all? The three main points, or that it's still very important or not so important? That would be really, I would appreciate that. Thank you. Great presentation so far.
I have to say that, I knew I live in Berkeley. I knew the International Bulletin people also, Van Austin, Bing, and some other folks. They did terrific work. The philosophy of Juche is it grows out of Korea's experience of being a kingdom at the turn of the 19th century that was heavily invested in foreign powers to maintain its sovereignty. And as a result of that, it never really developed its own independent program for modernization and self-defense. So the national liberation movement, independence movement that emerged in opposition to Japanese rule, had at its very core this concept that Koreans had to rely on their own resources to be able to fend their way in the world. And so the concept of Juche is something that Kim Il-sung emphasized in all his organizing during the anti-Japanese struggle and in all the economic programs and military programs that the DPRK pursued subsequent to liberation and still today. And philosophically, I think in 1970, Kim Il-sung commented that in German philosophy, the concept of Juche roughly corresponds to the concept of subject in terms of subject-object relations, positing the Korean people as the subjects, of their own destiny and so forth. So, yeah.
That's a great summarization. Great summarization. Thank you. Good
Okay.
start.
Again, we're almost over. Citizen One, if you have a quick question that could bring a quick response, please go ahead. You had your hand up for a while.
Yes, thank you. Since I addressed Jeeho about this before, I would like to emphasize that in my humble opinion, I think that your movement really should emphasize that all these antagonisms of the U.S., around the world are really to increase the profits of the U.S. military-industrial complex. I otherwise certainly don't believe that the U.S. is going to war with China unless, unlike many leftists say, an expert predicted that this would happen by December of 2022. And I called into KPFA and I said, that's not going to happen. The U.S. won't even go to war against Iran, which leftists have been predicting would happen as far back as 2003. So I also want to say real fast, for people who don't know, they should look up the Gwangju Massacre. It's spelled alternatively G-U-A-N-G-J-U or with a K-U-A-N-G-J-U. So you mentioned Black Alliance for Peace. I happen to be Black American, and I'm one of your multicultural supporters. So my question is that I'm wondering if you've reached out to any of the South Koreans who were students in the 1980s, because offhand, I think they could be valuable to your movement if that's possible. Thank you.
Go ahead, either of you, please. Paul
Sure.
or Jeeho, go ahead.
I can respond quickly.
And university students in particular, if I didn't say that.
Sorry?
Go ahead.
University students in the 1980s. I don't know if I specified university students in the 1980s.
Right. Got it. Yeah. Thank you so much for the suggestion. I'm not personally aware of any folks within our movement who were involved in Gwangju, in the Gwangju massacre at that time. But we are connected in general with folks who were activated and politicized as a result of the Gwangju massacre and the general democratization movement that involved a lot of college students in the 80s and 90s. And so we're definitely connected with those folks and agree that we can learn from, their movement and learn from the kind of experiences that they had building a different kind of anti-dictatorship movement at that time. And so thank you so much for that suggestion.
And I forgot to say that was under the supposedly kindly and human rights President Jimmy Carter. So he allowed, what I characterize as South Korea's Tiananmen Square. And so he's really gotten off light in history with regard to a lot of massacres, including in Indonesia, that he supported. And I just want to say real fast that Trump did not diffuse tensions with North Korea. Trump had to back down because there was no way that the U.S. was going to attack North Korea. It would have meant the destruction of U.S. military bases all over East Asia with North Korea's response with nuclear weapons.
Okay, I want to thank very, very much our speakers today, Paul and Jeeho. This has been just the most valuable and informative session that we've had in a very long time. I want to invite you to come back and participate again. I also want to thank the participants in today's session. I thought the questions were excellent and the responses were excellent. Please go to our website, ICSSmarks.org. Sign up for email notifications of our future programs. You can watch videos of our past programs. Come back next week to talk about the election. I think we need to tie this. Today we talked a lot about international affairs. We want to talk about domestic affairs, things that are going on that relate to the American people, the American working class, and the struggles that we're facing here. So with that, we're going to sign off. We're going to stop the recording, and thank you so much for coming today, everybody, and our speakers. This is a great, fantastic session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.